Chained, Cora was dragged through Larkspur Crossing's dust, while Sheriff Corwin Ash watched and smiled, and within the hour a gray-eyed rider would change everything about how that day ended. Wrists rubbed raw, dress torn at the shoulder, she couldn't manage more than a few trembling inches off the ground before her legs folded under her again, and two men kept hauling anyway. Dragging her down the center of the street, like livestock walked toward auction, while the sheriff sipped his morning whiskey off the jailhouse porch, as if it were nothing more than Sunday entertainment. I've narrated more than a few of these Kansas cattle town summers, and there's a shape they tend to fall into, a wrong done in plain daylight, a town too frightened or too well paid to look straight at it, and a stranger who happens along at exactly the wrong moment for the men doing the wronging. This is one of those stories. Stick with me to the end, because before the dust settled on Larkspur Crossing that week, a small stolen notebook was going to do more damage to a corrupt lawman. Larkspur Crossing had grown fat that summer of 1879, the way railhead towns tend to, cattle money rolling through twice a season, freight wagons lined 3 deep outside the depot, and underneath all of it, if a person knew exactly where to look, a meaner kind of money that never once got spoken above a whisper. The two men holding the chain that morning were known around town as Dutch Malone and Tobias Renner, one thick through the neck and mean with it, the other lean and twitchy, always glancing toward the porch for approval the way a dog checks the hand that feeds it before deciding whether to bite. Dutch hauled the chain forward with a curse, dragging Cora another few feet through the dirt while her torn dress caught and tore further against the ground. Off to one side, arms folded, stood the man whose name would end up written across nearly every page of what came next. Sheriff Corwin Ash, in a black coat too clean for the heat, a coat that somehow never gathered trail dust the way an honest man's coat would, a silver star pinned dead center over his heart like it still meant something to him. In one hand he held a folded paper, freshly inked, crisp at every edge, a warrant that read clean and official to anyone who only glanced at it, a runaway indentured servant it claimed, who'd broken her contract and stolen wages from a lawful employer. It read exactly like the truth. That was the entire trick of it. Nobody in Larkspur Crossing had ever learned to question paper with a badge standing beside it. Ash hadn't always worn that badge crooked. Longtime residents of Larkspur Crossing still remembered a younger version of the man, 5 years back, who'd taken the job for honest reasons, and kept it honest for the better part of 2 seasons, before a run of bad cattle contracts left him owing money to people who didn't forgive a debt quietly. Ambrose Coy had been the one to cover that debt, and Coy never once asked for the money back in coin. He asked for favors instead, a warrant signed without too many questions, a blind eye turned toward a shipment that arrived after dark, a deputy assigned somewhere else on a night when Coy's business needed the street left empty. Small favors at first, easy enough for a man to tell himself they didn't amount to much. By the time Ash understood what he'd actually become, the debt had grown teeth of its own, and walking away from Coy would have meant walking away from the badge, the town, and very likely his own freedom along with it. There were nights, according to a deputy who later testified to it, when Ash drank alone in the jailhouse office, long after everyone else had gone home, staring at that same silver star, laid flat on his desk like it belonged to somebody else entirely. Whatever doubt lived in him during those private hours never once made it out into daylight. A man can carry 2 versions of himself for years if he's disciplined enough about which one he lets the town see, and Corwin Ash had gotten very disciplined indeed by the summer Cora tried to run. Coy's operation ran under the cover of the Blackwood Saloon, the way a rat's nest runs under a porch, visible enough that everyone half suspected it was there, hidden enough that nobody had ever found a reason worth the risk of looking closer. Girls came through Larkspur Crossing the way cattle and freight did, passed along under paper that always looked correct on its face. Indenture contracts, apprenticeship agreements, debts owed and being worked off. Because paper, Coy liked to say, when he thought only his own men were listening, that he didn't deal in flesh at all. He dealt in fear, he'd tell them, and fear was the one commodity that never once went out of season on the frontier, the one thing a person would trade almost anything to make go away. Cora hadn't been born to any of this. Orphaned young, raised by a seamstress aunt who taught her a needle and thread trade good enough to earn her keep in 3 different towns before the aunt passed, she'd signed what she believed was an honest apprenticeship contract with a Larkspur Crossing dressmaker, had passed through Ash's clerk and come out the other side, altered, her modest wage clause quietly struck and an ownership clause quietly added in its place. When she'd finally understood what the paper actually said and tried to walk away from it, that understanding was the theft Ash's warrant now accused her of. The dressmaker herself, a widow named Mrs. Halloway who ran the front of the shop and never once set foot in whatever arrangement operated behind it, likely never understood the full shape of what she'd been made a part of either. Coy's clerk handled the actual paperwork, threading altered contracts through her shop the way a river threads through low ground, using the honest business as cover for the dishonest one, so that any woman who came asking about her wages found only a bewildered widow who genuinely believed the contract on file matched the one she'd shaken hands over. Cora had gone to Mrs. Halloway first before she ever tried to run, and come away from that conversation understanding that the woman she'd trusted couldn't help her, because the woman she'd trusted didn't actually hold the truth either. That was the moment, more than any other, when Cora had decided that leaving quietly was no longer an option left to her. She'd made her first attempt at running 2 nights before the street, slipping out a back window of the room she'd been kept in above the saloon, and getting as far as the edge of town before Dutch Malone caught her wrist in the dark and dragged her back the way a man hauls in a fish that thought it had gotten free. That was when the chain first went on, meant as much to punish her for trying as to prevent her from trying again, and it was that same chain, unremoved through 2 full days afterward, that Emmett found still locked around her wrists the morning he rode into town. Coy liked his examples visible. A woman dragged openly through the main street. He'd always reasoned, taught every other woman in his back rooms a lesson far more effective than any punishment kept private ever could. Larkspur Crossing itself sprawled along a single wide main street lined with false-fronted buildings that always looked a little grander from a distance than they turned out to be up close, a mercantile, a bank with a fresh coat of paint that hadn't yet earned the trust to match it. The jailhouse, with its porch where Ash liked to hold court over his morning whiskey, and at the far end, the Blackwood Saloon itself, 2 stories of weathered lumber with lamplight that never seemed to fully go out even at the latest hours. It was, by every outward measure, an ordinary cattle town doing ordinary cattle town business, and that ordinariness was exactly what had let Coy's operation run as long as it had. Nobody looks twice at a wound hidden behind a coat of fresh paint. A rider came up the eastern trail around mid-morning, unhurried. A man named Emmett Hale, who had spent 3 years following a rumor, the way other men follow a compass, not because it promised much of anything. From a distance he saw the shape of the thing before he understood it. 2 men, a length of chain, a figure in the dirt, trying and failing to rise. As the distance closed, the shape resolved into a young woman, barefoot, wrists bound in iron, rubbed raw, and weeping at the edges. She pushed herself up on shaking arms one final time, made it as far as her knees, and that was as far as her body had left to give. Dutch yanked the chain again, and this time Emmett swung down without any particular hurry, the kind of unhurried that men who've survived real trouble learn to recognize as the most dangerous kind there is. He didn't reach for his gun. He walked forward, slow eyes moving from the chain to the two men holding it to the sheriff, who stood there, allowing all of it, reading the whole scene, the way a careful man reads a room before deciding what kind of trouble he's about to become. Tobias noticed him first and straightened too fast, the way guilty men always do. Dutch spat in the dirt without bothering to look up. Ash turned last, unbothered, the particular calm of a man who has never once doubted that the law, whatever shape he'd bent it into that week, stood squarely on his side of the argument. Emmett stopped close enough to see the raw blood wringing Cora's wrists. He looked down at her, really looked, the way a person looks at something worth remembering, and gave voice to the only thing that needed saying. "She can't walk anymore." Ash didn't so much as blink. "She don't have to walk. She just has to move. Got paper right here. Says she's a runaway servant. Theft broke contract. Ran off from a lawful employer, owed her wages back." He held the warrant up a little higher, like ink alone might settle what any pair of open eyes could already see plainly wasn't right. Funny thing about a lie. Emmett didn't raise his voice at all. It always dresses nicer than the truth does. Something in him had already shifted, quiet and final. A piece of paper, signed clean, being used to break a woman who couldn't even stand under it anymore. He'd ridden past 100 small cruelties across 3 years of chasing one particular answer. He wasn't riding past this one. Tobias stepped into his path, hand dropping toward his belt. Emmett caught the wrist before it got there, turned it hard, and put the man face first into the dirt without wasting a motion on it. Dutch hauled the chain tighter out of pure stubbornness, dragging Cora another few feet. Emmett stepped over her and planted a boot squarely between her body and the pull of the iron. Let go of it. Dutch hesitated one beat too long. Answer enough, on its own, for how far this man was willing to push it without backup standing behind him. Emmett didn't draw his Colt. He just looked at Dutch the way older men look at younger ones. They've already buried a version of in memory. And the chain finally went slack in Dutch's hand. Careful now, Stranger Ash's friendliness had thinned out considerably. "That's lawful custody. You're planting your boot into." Emmett didn't answer that one at all. He crouched beside Cora, pulled a small cutting tool from his saddlebag, and worked the iron until it gave with a dull metallic snap that seemed, for 1 second, louder than everything else on that street. He got an arm under her shoulders, helped her sit up against his horse's foreleg, and uncapped a canteen against her lips until she could hold it herself. "Name," he offered, less a question than a small kindness, the chance to be known as something other than the thing written on the warrant. "Cora." The word came out as little more than a rasp, worn thin from thirst and dust. "All right, Cora." He meant to remember it, and he did. "You are making a serious mistake." Mr. Ash's warmth had gone entirely now. "That woman is wanted. Then you're welcome to come collect her." Emmett kept his eyes on Cora, not the sheriff. Somewhere, she's able to stand up when you do. By then, 2 freight drivers had reined their wagons to a stop in the street, and a ranch hand outside the mercantile had frozen mid-stride, all three of them caught in that particular stillness of people deciding, in real time. Ash wasn't afraid of one rider, he was afraid of witnesses, and Larkspur Crossing had suddenly produced 3 too many of them in open daylight. "This isn't finished, stranger, not by a long stretch." He jerked his chin toward Dutch. "Let her be, for now." Emmett didn't look much like the kind of man Larkspur Crossing was used to reckoning with. No polished gun rig, no reputation riding ahead of him into town, just a weathered gray poncho, gone thin at the shoulders, gray eyes that gave away almost nothing, and the unhurried way he moved that made people watching him uneasy without quite being able to say why. He swung back up into the saddle, with Cora settled carefully in front of him, and nobody on that street tried to stop him a second time. The 2 freight drivers who'd paused to watch exchanged a look that neither one put into words. The ranch hand outside the mercantile finally remembered to breathe. None of them yet understood how much that morning had actually cost the sheriff, or how little time he had left to spend the authority he'd built his whole career on borrowing. Before this story rides on any further, I want to say one plain thing, because it matters to me that this channel keeps telling stories like Cora's. If a chained woman set free by a stranger who wouldn't ride past is the kind of justice you come back for, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member. The line shack Emmett kept near a bend of Cottonmouth Creek wasn't much to look at. 1 room, a stone hearth, a roof that had seen better decades. But it sat well off any traveled road, and after a morning like that one, he got a fire going, put water on to boil, dug a spare shirt out of his saddlebag for Cora to change into. Once the coffee had steadied her hands enough to hold the cup herself, she sat close to the flame with a blanket around her shoulders, and didn't offer much at first, the particular quiet of someone deciding how much of a hard truth a stranger has earned the right to hear. "You should have left me where you found me. Didn't feel like it." He kept his eyes on the coffee pot. That was the whole reason, piece by piece. Over that long afternoon, Cora laid the rest of it out for him. A dressmaker's shop that had turned out to be a front for something far uglier. A back room behind the Blackwood Saloon, with doors that locked only from the outside. Names taken away from women the day they arrived. Men who paid to look, men who paid to own outright, and above the whole arrangement running it like any other line of business. A man named Ambrose Coy, a man who had built his fortune, as far as Cora understood it, on selling other people's fear back to them a little at a time, until there was nothing left of a person worth selling. She described the room she'd shared briefly with 3 other women before her attempted escape, the particular hunger of not knowing whether tomorrow would look any different from today, the way fear settles into a person's shoulders after enough weeks of it. Emmett listened without interrupting, feeding the fire, letting her set whatever pace she needed. Healing, he'd learned somewhere over 3 hard years of his own, rarely comes at the pace anybody else would prefer. The days that followed at the creek shack settled into a quiet rhythm neither of them named out loud. Mornings, Emmett checked snares and brought back whatever small game the creek bottom offered. Afternoons, Cora sat in what sun the cottonwoods let through and let her wrists finish scabbing over the raw red rings slowly fading toward something that would eventually just be scar. On the 3rd morning, she stood on her own for the first time since the street, one hand braced against the door frame, and made it the length of the room and back before her legs gave out again, a small enough thing to most people, and everything to her. Emmett didn't rush to catch her when she wavered. He'd learned, watching his own sister's absence teach him more than he'd ever wanted to know about grief and patience both, that a person recovering their footing needs the room to nearly fall and not be caught every single time. Then came the sentence that changed the whole shape of the day. There was a woman in the room next to mine. Didn't belong there, the way the rest of us didn't belong there. Carried herself different, prayed some nights out loud when she thought nobody was listening, and never once accepted the name Coy's people hung on her. Used her real one instead, quiet, like she was keeping a promise to somebody. Emmett's voice had gone very still. What name? Naomi. The name hit him harder than a bullet ever had, and he'd taken 2 of those across his life and lived through both. Naomi Hale, his younger sister, 3 years gone since a boarding house fire outside a Texas railhead had taken. Everyone standing at that graveside had assured him every soul under that roof the night it burned. He'd buried an empty coffin because there hadn't been enough left to fill a full one, and yet some part of him had never let the grief finish its work, because some part of him had never quite believed the fire had shown him the whole truth. 3 years of thin trails, false names in border towns, letters that led nowhere, and he had kept writing anyway because stopping had always felt like the one thing he couldn't survive. He'd been 3 counties away the night that boarding house burned, hired onto a cattle drive that had promised good pay, and had needed every hand it could get, and he'd carried the weight of that timing every single day since. Not guilt exactly. If he'd turned down that drive, some version of the fire's ending might have gone differently. He'd chased word of Naomi through a 6 towns across 3 states in the years since, following rumors that mostly dissolved the moment he arrived close enough to test them. A girl matching her description working a hotel kitchen in Abilene who turned out to be somebody else's daughter entirely. A name half remembered by a traveling preacher that led to a grave marker instead of a living woman. A letter that promised answers and delivered only a forwarding address 3 months stale by the time it reached him. Most men would have let the trail go cold and called it mourning. Emmett had never quite been able to make himself stop, and sitting across a small fire from a stranger named Cora, hearing his sister's real name spoken out loud for the first time in 3 years, he understood all at once exactly why he hadn't. Cora reached into the torn lining of her dress and drew out a small, worn notebook, its cover gone soft from handling. I lifted this off Coy's desk the night before they caught me trying to run. Didn't even understand half of what was in it at first. She handed it over. Names filled the pages beside, columns of figures, dates, sums far too large for the kind of business a saloon usually did on paper, and running through nearly every entry, a single set of initials that showed up too often to be coincidence. D. The sheriff isn't just looking the other way. Her voice had dropped low. He's in these pages himself. Full dark had settled over the creek when a horse shifted somewhere outside. Once, soft and wrong, not the sound a picketed animal makes on its own account. Cora heard it too and went still by the hearth, the particular stillness of somebody who had learned, over recent weeks, exactly how much danger a single wrong sound could announce. Emmett blew out the lantern and moved to the door without a sound. It pushed open a moment later, a shape stepping through with a gun already leveled, and Emmett hit him from the side before the man's eyes had finished adjusting to the dark, a strike to the wrist that sent the pistol clattering across the floorboards, a second strike to the jaw that put him down for good. Outside, along the tree line, a second shape hung back, Dutch Malone unwilling to close the distance now that his hired gun had gone quiet. Emmett fired once into the dirt, a few feet from Dutch's boots, close enough to make the point without making it permanent, and Dutch's horse was already wheeling before the echo finished rolling off across the creek bottom. A man with no backup rarely stays brave for long. Morning broke, hot and dry, the particular kind of Kansas heat that starts pressing down before the sun's fully cleared the grass. They rode back toward Larkspur Crossing rather than away from it, not because the town had grown any safer overnight, but because the truth of the whole thing lived there, and so, behind some locked door, Emmett brought Cora first to a modest clapboard house at the edge of town, where an aging doctor named Kessler kept his practice, a man whose steady hands had outlasted 3 decades of frontier medicine. Kessler had buried a wife of his own to fever some 15 years back, and had never remarried, pouring what was left of that particular kind of devotion into every patient who came through his door instead, regardless of whether they could pay him in coin, in trade, or in nothing at all. It was a reputation that had made him, over the years, one of the few people in Larkspur Crossing that both the respectable and the desperate trusted in equal measure. Doc Kessler didn't sugarcoat the examination, and he didn't need many words to deliver it. Nothing broken, he found. Exhaustion instead, dehydration, bruising down to the bone in places, and more plain fear in her than any one person ought to have to carry around alone. She could sit a horse again by sundown if it came to that. Walking proud, though, would take a good deal longer than a single night's rest could fix. The old doctor had heard something else that morning, too. The way word travels in a town small enough that everybody's business ends up belonging to everybody eventually. A deputy had been asking after a gray-eyed man in a weathered duster. Hale. Doc's eyes lingered on him a beat too long. There's folks in this county haven't forgotten what happened down in Texas 3 years back. Word travels, even the kind a man wishes it wouldn't. Across the street, a fresh notice had gone up on the board outside the jailhouse, ink still dark enough to smell. Notice of arrest, Cora Lennox, theft, assault, breach of indentured contract. Beneath it, tacked on almost as an afterthought. That wasn't really an afterthought at all. Emmett Hale, interfering with lawful custody of a fugitive, to be considered armed. Ash was building his case in plain daylight now, papering over what he'd done with still more paper, the same trick that had put a chain around Cora's wrists to begin with. Not every witness that morning had the nerve to look away from that board. A ranch hand named Otis Pruitt, one of the men who'd frozen mid-stride watching Cora dragged through the street the day before, stood reading the notice a long while, jaw tight, hat brim low against the sun, before he finally turned and walked off toward the livery without buying a single thing he'd come to town for. He wasn't the only one in Larkspur Crossing that week wrestling with a conscience the sheriff had counted on staying quiet a good deal longer than it was about to. 2 of Ash's deputies had ridden out toward the creek country that same afternoon, working off nothing more than a rumor of smoke rising from an old line shack nobody was supposed to be using, and for a stretch of nearly an hour Emmett kept Cora low behind a stand of willows while the deputies worked the far bank without ever crossing to the near one. It was close enough that Cora's breathing had gone shallow and careful beside him. Close enough that Emmett had one hand resting quiet on his Colt the entire time, without ever needing to draw it. The deputies gave up the search before dusk, more interested in getting back to town before dark than in combing every willow stand along a creek that ran for miles, and neither of them ever knew how close they'd actually come. "We stop running now." There wasn't much room left in Emmett's voice for anything but certainty. Before Emmett crossed that town after dark, there's one more thing worth pausing on. If you're the kind of viewer who stays for the whole ride, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It keeps stories like this one coming. Emmett spent the better part of that afternoon learning the shape of Larkspur Crossing, the way a man learns a battlefield before he walks onto it, which alleys ran clear behind the Blackwood Saloon, where the freight house sat squat and windowless behind it, which of Ash's deputies drank too much to be reliable past 9 o'clock, and which didn't drink at all and had to be watched closer for it. Doc Kessler, it turned out, had buried more than a few young women from that saloon's back rooms over the years without ever being told a cause of death he fully believed, and he gave Emmett what he knew about the building's layout in exchange for nothing but a promise that whoever was still breathing behind those doors would walk out of them by morning. There was a barkeep at the Blackwood, too. An older man named Franklin Odets who poured drinks for Coy's regular customers 6 nights a week, and had spent most of those years pretending not to hear the sounds that sometimes carried through the wall behind the bar. He caught Emmett's eye once that afternoon while restocking barrels out back, and though neither man said a single word to the other, something passed between them anyway. The wordless understanding of one man recognizing that another had finally decided to do something Odets himself had lacked the courage to do alone. That night, when the moment came, the side door behind the saloon happened to be left unlatched. Night found Emmett moving along the back alleys toward the freight house, a squat brick building set behind the saloon, where Coy conducted the part of his business that never appeared on any ledger meant for public eyes. One guard sat half asleep on an upturned crate by the side door, careless for an operation moving that much misery through its rooms. But careless men make careless mistakes, and 3 years of chasing thin trails to nowhere had taught Emmett. He put the guard down quiet before the man's chin had finished settling against his own chest. A narrow hallway ran the length of the building, doors lining one side, each bolted from the outside like a row of cells dressed up as ordinary storage. Behind the first door, he broke the lock and found 2 women huddled together in the dark, eyes wide with the particular fear of people who've learned that any sound at night usually means something worse than whatever came before it. Behind the second, a third woman, younger still, who flinched hard at the light before her eyes, adjusted enough to understand he wasn't one of Coy's men. Oh. He left the doors standing open behind him and told each of them, low and steady, to wait by the side entrance until he came back for them. Not an order so much as the first kindness any of them had been offered in longer than they could say, and every one of them took it, because after being handed even one small choice again meant something. At the far end of the hall, a single lamp still burned low behind a half-open door, and there, seated on a narrow cot with her spine held very straight, was the woman Coy's people had taken to calling Grace. She looked up, and it was Naomi, older in every way that had nothing to do with the calendar, 3 years carved into the set of her shoulders and the wariness behind her eyes, but unmistakably his sister, alive in a building he'd walked past twice already searching for exactly this and finding nothing. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice shook only a little. Been hearing that a lot from people lately. He crossed the small room in 3 strides and knelt in front of her, and for one long moment, neither of them needed to say anything else out loud. On the narrow desk beside her cot sat a second ledger, thicker than the notebook Cora had carried, heavier with whatever full accounting Coy kept for himself when he never expected another soul to read it. There would be time later for the whole of Naomi's own 3 years, but in the small space before Coy filled the doorway, she managed the shape of it in a handful of sentences. How she'd survived the fire by being out at a neighbor's that night fetching medicine. How she'd come back to find the boarding house gone, and half the county already certain every soul inside it had perished. How a man passing through, offering honest work, had turned out 3 towns later to be one of Coy's people scouting for exactly the kind of woman with no family left to come looking for her. She'd let the world keep believing her dead rather than risk word reaching whatever family she had left, and putting them in the same danger, never once imagining that the brother she'd assumed had long since stopped searching. The moment stretched, and Emmett understood, watching his sister's face, that some debts a person carries 3 years without knowing whether they'll ever get the chance to settle them. He didn't get the chance to say any of that out loud before the doorway darkened behind him. It was enough in that brief space that Naomi had reached up and gripped his sleeve once, hard, the way she used to as a girl, half his size, trailing after him across their family's yard. A small gesture that told him everything 3 years of silence hadn't been able to, and one he carried with him through everything that happened next. That was when Ambrose Coy filled the doorway, pistol held low and easy in one hand, the posture of a man who had never once had to use force personally, because other men had always done it for him until tonight. You are not walking out of here with both of them. Behind him, arriving exactly on schedule the way a man does when he's been sent for, Sheriff Corwin Ashe stepped into the hall with his own gun already drawn and level. Emmett understood in that single breath that he hadn't walked into a rescue at all. He'd walked straight into a trap that had been waiting on him since the moment word of a gray-eyed man first reached the wrong ears. For one long second, nobody in that room moved. Coy's eyes went from the ledger in Naomi's arms to the gun in his own hand and back again, doing the same arithmetic every desperate man does in the last few seconds before he decides violence is the only math left available to him. Ashe held his position in the doorway, gun steady, the calm mask he'd worn on the street that first morning, cracking just slightly at the edges now that the crowd of witnesses he'd always feared more than any single man had finally caught up to what he'd built. Somewhere down the hall, one of the freed women let out a breath that carried further than she meant it to, and that small sound seemed to be the thing that finally tipped Coy's nerve past whatever was left holding it together. Coy fired first, because fear moves a man's finger faster than his sense can catch up to it. Emmett threw himself sideways, brought his Colt up, and put a single round through Coy's gun hand. The pistol spun free and clattered against the floorboards. Naomi swept the heavy ledger off the desk and pulled it hard against her chest, and in that instant the fight stopped being only about who walked out of that hallway breathing. It turned into a fight over what was written across those pages, names, sums, dates, a small-town accounting of exactly how much human suffering had passed through Larkspur Crossing, dressed up as lawful business. Ashe fired next, and Emmett stepped bodily between the bullet's path, and Naomi felt the round pass close enough to hear it, and returned fire clean. Ashe's arm snapped back, his own pistol spinning across the floor out of reach. Coy lunged for the fallen ledger anyway, desperate now that everything he'd spent a decade building sat balanced on whether those pages stayed hidden or came out into daylight. That was the moment Cora appeared in the doorway behind them, still limping badly. Doc Kessler, a step behind her with his black bag still in hand. She'd refused to stay behind, and nobody who knew her by then would have argued the point for long. She hooked the loose length of chain still trailing from her own wrist with the toe of her boot and dragged it hard across Coy's legs. He went down mid-lunge, and Emmett was on him before he could rise again, driving him flat against the floorboards for good. There was something almost fitting in it, the very chain Coy's men had used to drag her through the street, becoming the thing that finally put him down. A small, sharp piece of justice that no court would ever record but that Cora would carry with her satisfied. Ash, clutching his ruined arm against his chest, made one last try for the door before Franklin Odetts appeared in the hallway behind him, with a shotgun he'd kept under the bar for exactly this kind of night, and had never once expected to actually raise. Outside, boots were already running, more of them than Emmett expected, and not deputies answering a call either. Ranch hands, shopkeepers, a depot clerk with ink still staining his fingers. Ordinary people of Larkspur Crossing who had lost daughters and sisters and nieces to that back room over the years and had swallowed the loss in silence because silence had always seemed safer. The ledger changed that math within minutes. Once people started recognizing names in Coy's careful hand, fathers, husbands, a banker's own cousin, Islands stopped feeling like the wiser choice it had always pretended to be. Ward moves fast once the first person in a small town decides out loud that they aren't afraid anymore, and by sunup half the county already seemed to know some version of what had happened in that freight house behind the Blackwood Saloon. Men who'd looked the other way for years found their own names staring back at them from those pages. And there is no version of respectability that survives that particular kind of daylight for long. The circuit judge arrived from the county seat within the week, summoned by 3 separate telegrams sent by 3 separate townsfolk, each one certain somebody else hadn't already sent it. Otis Pruitt was among the first to stand up in that courtroom, hat in his hands, and describe exactly what he'd watched happen on the street the day Cora was dragged through it. The sort of testimony a man only gives once he's decided the cost of staying silent. He wasn't alone. A rancher's wife, who'd lost a niece 2 winters back, stood next, and after her, a stagecoach agent, and by the 3rd day the line of people willing to speak against Ash and Coy had grown longer than anyone in Larkspur Crossing would have predicted possible even a week earlier. Mrs. Holloway came forward as well, her voice unsteady but her account precise, laying out exactly how her shop's records had been used without her knowledge, and though nobody in that courtroom blamed her for it, the telling seemed to cost her something all the same. The particular grief of a decent person, realizing how thoroughly they'd been made complicit in something they never would have chosen. Franklin Odetts testified last of the town's own, admitting flatly that he'd known enough for years to have said something sooner and hadn't found the courage until a stranger, in a weathered poncho, walked into his saloon and made staying silent. The judge himself read a portion of the ledger into the record on the 2nd day, and the courtroom went quieter than it had been for any single witness. Entry after entry, dates running back nearly 6 years. Sums of money paid and received beside names that included 2 of the town's own councilmen. A notation in Coy's own hand describing Cora simply as new stock. No name attached, dated the week she'd first been brought in under Mrs. Holloway's contract. Hearing herself reduced to those 2 words, read aloud in a public courtroom, was in its own way harder for Cora to sit through than the chain had been. And yet she stayed seated through every line of it because she understood, better than most people in that room, exactly how much it mattered that those words finally be spoken out where everyone could hear them. 3 years. And it ended not with a rope and not with pure vengeance, but with a truth that had finally grown too heavy for anyone left in Larkspur Crossing to keep burying. Sheriff Corwin Ashe stood before that circuit judge in the very courthouse he'd once used his star to intimidate, stripped of the badge that had let him dress up a lie as law for as long as he had. Ambrose Coy stood beside him, and this time there was no forged warrant clever enough to turn the truth back into a lie a second time. The story reached beyond Larkspur Crossing within days, carried along the telegraph wire the way news of a breakout always travels faster than news of anything ordinary. A corrupt sheriff exposed by his own ledger. Papers in 3 neighboring counties picked up some version of it, most of them getting a few details wrong and none of them ever learning Emmett's full history, which suited him fine. He'd never once ridden into Larkspur Crossing looking to become anybody's story. He'd only ever been looking for one particular name. Watching a corrupt badge finally answer for it is exactly why this channel exists. Tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member today. Morning came different after that. The particular kind of different that only shows up once something rotten has finally been cut clean out of a place. Naomi stood outside the courthouse steps in the pale early light, not hiding behind anyone's shoulder and not running from anything either, her own name spoken out loud and recorded plainly for the first time in 3 years. Cora stood beside her, still healing, still favoring one leg more than the other, but upright. And there is a particular kind of pride in a person standing on their own 2 feet, after they've been convinced by chains and by men who thought chains settled arguments that they never would again. The other women Coy had held disappeared quietly back into lives of their own choosing. Some toward family who'd never once stopped looking. Some toward towns where nobody yet knew a single line of their story, every one of them walking out under her own power. The 2 women Emmett had first found behind the freight house's second door turned out to be sisters themselves, separated from a homesteading family 2 counties east, and Doc Kessler personally arranged the wagon that carried them home within the week. The younger woman from the 3rd room, barely 17, chose to stay on in Larkspur Crossing under Mrs. Kauf, Halloway's roof, learning the dressmaking trade alongside Cora, and within a year the 2 of them had built a friendship neither one had expected out of a place that had once held nothing but fear for either of them. I've said before that most of these stories don't end with a rope, and this one is no different, though I'll admit it came closer than most to needing one. There's a particular kind of satisfaction, though, in watching a lie collapse under the weight of its own paperwork instead, in watching a town's own conscience finally do the work that no single gunslinger ever could have managed alone. Emmett stayed back a few respectful steps, the way he had at the edge of most rooms for 3 years running. Not because he didn't belong there, but because some part of him had never learned how to stand at the center of anything, and hadn't set out that week to start learning it now. He didn't reach for Naomi's hand to lead her forward. He didn't take Cora's arm as though either of them needed steering. He'd found what he'd spent 3 years searching for, and he'd helped pull 2 women free of something that should never have existed in the first place, and to his mind, that was the whole of what the morning required of him, nothing claimed, nothing owed back in return. Most men, in my experience telling stories like this one, don't lose whatever decency they started with all at once. They lose it one quiet choice at a time, one time looking the other way, one time letting the wrong man hold the chain, because objecting seemed like more trouble than it was worth. Emmett Hale hadn't ridden into Larkspur Crossing that summer meaning to fix the whole of it, and he didn't. He hadn't set out to save every woman that back room had ever swallowed, and he couldn't. But he'd stopped one wrong thing from continuing the moment it crossed his path, and he'd stopped it without needing to become the kind of man who solves every problem with a gun. A small tool from a saddlebag had freed the chain that mattered most, and a stolen notebook no bigger than a hand had done the rest of the work. No bullet ever could have managed alone. Before he rode out, Naomi asked him to stay a little longer, and for one evening he did, sat with her on Doc Kessler's porch while the two of them worked back through 3 years of separate hardship in careful, unhurried pieces, the way people do when they've decided a friendship or a family bond is worth rebuilding slowly. She told him she meant to stay in Larkspur Crossing a while, at least until the trial's finished, and the last of Coy's men had been accounted for, and that she'd write once she'd settled wherever she landed after that. Cora, for her part, took over what remained of Mrs. Bodge. Holloway's shop within the month, the widow glad to hand the business to someone who'd earned the town's trust the hard way, and the dresses that came out of that shop afterward carried a reputation for honest measurements and honest prices that outlasted every one of them. On his last morning in town, Cora found Emmett checking his saddle cinch outside Doc Kessler's stable and pressed a small, folded square of cloth into his hand before he could swing up a handkerchief she'd stitched herself in the evening since the trial. Plain work, but careful. The kind of gift a person makes when words alone don't feel like enough thanks for a debt they know they'll never fully repay. He didn't say much back to her, only tucked it into his saddlebag beside the small cutting tool that had started the whole thing, and for a moment the two of them stood there in a silence that had nothing uneasy left in it at all. Two people who'd walked through something ugly together, without ever needing to call it anything more than that. He rode out of Larkspur Crossing a few days later, alone, the way he'd ridden into it, following whatever thin trail came next because that was simply the shape of the life he'd chosen, and never seemed inclined to trade for another one. Behind him, a town kept rebuilding itself into something more honest than it had been the week before. A sister stood free under her own name for the first time in 3 years. A woman named Cora walked a little straighter every single morning. Proof enough that some chains, once broken, don't get another chance to close. Sometimes that's the whole of what one man riding past at exactly the right moment can give a place. Not a happy ending wrapped up neat, but a start towards something better than what came before it. And on a hard summer in Kansas cattle country,